For 17 days, a city burned. When the flames finally died down, the Romans walked through the ashes and did something no civilization had ever done before. They erased Carthage from history. They tore down every wall, burned every scroll, and according to legend, even salted the earth so nothing would ever grow there again. But here's the part nobody talks about. Just 60 years earlier, this same city had brought Rome to its knees. A Carthaginian general had marched elephants over the freaking Alps in winter, slaughtered 50,000 Roman soldiers in a single afternoon, and stood at the gates of Rome itself. So how did Carthage go from being the most powerful empire in the Mediterranean to being so completely destroyed that we barely know what language they spoke? Today, you'd struggle to find Carthage on a map. But 2,200 years ago, Rome was the underdog and Carthage was the superpower. Let's start at the beginning. Our story begins around 814 BC on the coast of modern-day Tunisia. A Phoenician princess named Dido fled her homeland after her brother murdered her husband for his gold. She landed in North Africa and asked the local king for some land. The king, being cheeky, told her she could have as much land as she could cover with a single ox hide. Most people would have given up. Dido did not. She cut that ox hide into the thinnest strips imaginable and used them to encircle an entire hill. The king, impressed or maybe just annoyed, let her keep it. On that hill she built a city called Carthage, which means new city. We know it as Carthage. While Carthage was growing into a Mediterranean trading empire, Rome was still a muddy village of shepherds. Carthage had massive harbors, a navy that ruled the seas and trading posts from Spain to Sicily. They had olive oil, purple dye worth more than gold, and silver mines that made them obscenely rich. Rome had, well, hills and cows. For 500 years, the two cities barely noticed each other. Carthage looked west to the ocean and Africa. Rome looked inward at conquering Italy. They were like two kids playing in different sandboxes, but sandboxes have edges, and eventually those edges were going to collide, and when they did, only one of them would be left standing. By 264 BC, Rome had finally conquered all of Italy. They were feeling pretty good about themselves. Carthage, meanwhile, had been the dominant power in the western Mediterranean for centuries. Their ships dominated trade. Their merchants were richer than kings. And then both of these powers looked at the same island at the same time, Sicily, that triangle-shaped island sitting right between them. Whoever controlled Sicily controlled the central Mediterranean. It was the most valuable real estate in the ancient world, and neither side was willing to share. So in 264 BC, over a dispute about a single city in Sicily, the First Punic War began. Spoiler alert. It would last 23 years. Here's the problem Rome faced. Carthage had the greatest navy in the world. They had been sailors for 500 years. Rome had basically 0 ships and 0 sailors. It was like Switzerland deciding to challenge the United States Navy. So what did Rome do? Something absolutely insane. A Carthaginian warship washed up on the Italian coast during a storm. The Romans literally took it apart, studied how it was built, and then built 100 copies of it in just 60 days. 60 days. To build a navy from scratch. Then they trained farmers and shepherds to be sailors by having them practice rowing on dry land. It should have been a complete disaster. Instead, Rome invented a secret weapon called the corvus, a giant boarding bridge with a spike that would crash down on enemy ships and let Roman soldiers swarm aboard. Suddenly, naval battles became infantry battles, and Rome had the best infantry in the world. The Carthaginians were stunned. Their sailors were the greatest in the world, but it didn't matter when Romans were swinging swords on their decks. Battle after battle, Rome won. Carthage lost ships, lost money, lost confidence. But Rome also paid a terrible price. They lost over 500 ships and 250,000 men, mostly to storms. Entire fleets just vanished beneath the waves. By 241 BC, Carthage was broke and exhausted. They sued for peace. Rome demanded a massive indemnity, payment for the war, and they took Sicily. Carthage had lost, but here's where the story gets interesting. Because losing this war didn't destroy Carthage. It created something far more dangerous: Inside Carthage, a young boy was watching his father return home in defeat, and that boy was making a promise that would shake the Roman world to its foundations. The boy's name was Hannibal. He was just 9 years old when his father, the great Carthaginian general Hamilcar Barca, took him to a temple. Hamilcar made his son place his hand on the altar and swear an oath. "Promise me you will never be a friend to Rome." Hannibal swore it, and he meant it. That oath would haunt Rome for the next 50 years, because Hannibal wasn't just any kid. He was being raised in a military camp in Spain, where his father was building a new Carthaginian empire from scratch. While Roman kids were learning Latin and farming, Hannibal was learning tactics, languages, survival, and most importantly, how to lead men into hell and bring them back alive. After the First Punic War, Carthage had a choice. They could rebuild slowly through trade, or they could find new territory to replace what they'd lost. They chose Spain. Hamilcar took his army across the sea and started conquering the Iberian Peninsula. Spain had silver, lots of it. So much silver that within 20 years, Carthage was richer than they'd ever been. And they had a new army, fierce Spanish warriors loyal not to Carthage, but to the Barca family personally. Hamilcar died in battle when Hannibal was 18. His son-in-law took over, then got assassinated. And in 221 BC, at just 26 years old, Hannibal became commander of the Carthaginian army in Spain. He was young, brilliant, and absolutely obsessed with destroying Rome. Rome had been watching all this with growing concern. They drew a line in Spain at the Ebro River and told Carthage, "Don't cross this." Hannibal looked at that line and smiled. Then he attacked a city called Saguntum, which was technically south of the line but had an alliance with Rome. Rome sent ambassadors demanding Carthage hand Hannibal over. The Carthaginian Senate refused. So in 218 BC, Rome declared war. The Second Punic War had begun. Rome assumed this would be a repeat of the First War. They'd send armies to Spain and Africa, win some battles, force Carthage to surrender. They had the bigger army, better generals, more resources. What they didn't realize is that Hannibal had been planning this war his entire life. And he was about to do something so audacious, so completely insane that 2,200 years later, military academies still study it. Hannibal wasn't going to wait for Rome to come to him. He was going to bring the war directly to Italy. In the spring of 218 BC, Hannibal gathered his army in Spain. 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants. War elephants. Picture that for a second. Massive armored beasts trained to crush men beneath their feet, and panic enemy horses. Hannibal looked at his army, looked at the map, and made a decision that should have been impossible. He was going to march to Italy. Not by sea where Rome ruled the waves, by land, through hostile Spanish tribes across the Pyrenees Mountains, through the savage Gauls of southern France, and then over the Alps, in winter, with elephants. The Romans literally did not consider this possible. They thought it was so impossible they didn't even bother defending against it. That was their first mistake. The march was a nightmare from day one. Spanish tribes attacked them constantly. Gauls ambushed them in forest passes. By the time Hannibal reached the foot of the Alps, he had already lost half his army. And the worst was still ahead. The Alps in October are brutal. Freezing temperatures, blinding blizzards, narrow paths along cliff edges where one wrong step meant a 1,000-foot drop. Mountain tribes rolled boulders down on them from above. Men and animals slipped on ice and fell to their deaths. They ran out of food. Soldiers ate their pack animals. Then they ate the leather from their shields. The elephants, magnificent African elephants from Carthage, suffered terribly. Some legends say only one elephant survived the crossing, Hannibal's personal mount named Surus. After 15 days in the mountains, Hannibal descended into northern Italy with what was left of his army. He had started with over 100,000 men. He arrived with maybe 26,000. Cold, starving, half-dead. Any sane general would have retreated. Instead, Hannibal looked at his exhausted survivors and gave a speech that became legendary. He pointed at the rich Italian plains below and said, "There, that is your reward, conquer or die." The Romans, when they heard Hannibal was actually in Italy, panicked. They sent an army to crush him immediately. They expected to find a broken, starving force. What they found was something else entirely. Hannibal knew his men were outnumbered. He knew they were weaker. So he didn't fight Rome's way. He fought his way. And in the next 2 years, he would inflict on Rome the worst military defeats in their entire history. Defeats so catastrophic, Rome thought it was over. The first major battle came at the Trebia River in December 218 BC. Hannibal didn't just want to win. He wanted to humiliate Rome. So he sent a small force to provoke the Roman army on a freezing cold morning. The Romans, eager and overconfident, charged across the icy river without breakfast. By the time they reached Hannibal's main army, they were exhausted, freezing, and starving. Hannibal had hidden his brother Mago with 2,000 cavalry in tall grass behind the Roman lines. When the battle began, Mago burst out and attacked from behind. The Romans were surrounded, frozen, and slaughtered. 30,000 Romans died. Hannibal lost almost no one. Rome was shocked, but they made an even bigger mistake. They sent another army. The next disaster happened at Lake Trasimene in 217 BC. The new Roman commander, a hothead named Flaminius, chased Hannibal into a narrow valley between hills and a lake. It was foggy that morning. The Romans couldn't see what was waiting for them. Hannibal had hidden his entire army in the hills above the road. When the Roman column was completely strung out along the lake, Hannibal sprang the trap. His soldiers poured down from the hills. There was nowhere to run. The lake was on one side, mountains on the other. 15,000 Romans were killed in 3 hours. Another 15,000 were captured. Flaminius himself was hunted down and killed by a Gallic warrior. It was the largest ambush in military history. Rome was now genuinely terrified. They appointed a dictator named Fabius Maximus who came up with a new strategy. Don't fight Hannibal, just follow him. Burn the food, starve him out. The Romans hated this. It looked cowardly. They called Fabius the delayer as an insult. They wanted glory, not patience. So in 216 BC, they elected 2 new commanders who promised to crush Hannibal once and for all. They raised the largest army Rome had ever assembled, 86,000 men, 8 full legions. They marched out to find Hannibal and end this nightmare. They found him at a small town in southern Italy called Canna. What happened that day on August 2nd, 216 BC, is still studied in every military academy on Earth, because Hannibal, outnumbered nearly 2 to 1, was about to execute the most perfect battle plan ever conceived. A plan so brilliant it would become the holy grail of military strategy for the next 2,200 years. The plains of Canna were flat and dry that August morning. The Romans lined up in their classic formation, a massive block of infantry in the center, cavalry on both wings, 86,000 men, the largest army in Roman history. They were going to use their numbers to simply smash through Hannibal's smaller force. Hannibal had only 50,000 men. He lined them up in what looked like a crescent moon shape, with his weakest troops in the middle, bulging forward toward the Romans. His best veterans, the African heavy infantry, were placed on the flanks. His cavalry was on the wings. The Romans saw the formation and laughed. The Carthaginian center looked weak, vulnerable, ready to break. They were going to charge straight through it. That was exactly what Hannibal wanted. The battle began. The Romans charged the center. Just as Hannibal planned, his weak center began to bend backward, slowly, steadily. The Roman commanders thought they were winning. They pushed more troops into the center to break through. More and more Romans crammed into the bulge. The Carthaginian crescent slowly inverted, the center bending inward like a bowl. And then, while the Romans were focused on the center, 2 things happened that doomed them forever. First, Hannibal's veteran African infantry, who had been waiting on the flanks, suddenly turned inward and attacked the sides of the Roman column. Second, the Carthaginian cavalry, which had already destroyed the Roman cavalry, came charging back and slammed into the Roman rear. The Romans were now completely surrounded. 86,000 men packed into a space so tight they couldn't even raise their swords. What happened next wasn't a battle. It was a massacre. For 8 hours, the Carthaginians killed Romans. The outer ranks were cut down, then the next ranks, then the next. The Romans in the center couldn't move, couldn't fight, couldn't even fall down because the bodies of their comrades held them upright. By sunset, the field at Cannae was covered with corpses. 50,000 to 70,000 Roman soldiers were dead in a single afternoon. To put that in perspective, that's more Americans than died in the entire Vietnam War, killed in 8 hours, with swords and spears. Cannae remains one of the bloodiest single days of combat in human history. Rome had just suffered the worst defeat in its 500-year existence. The road to Rome was wide open. Hannibal had the chance to end the empire forever, so why didn't he? This is one of history's greatest mysteries. After Cannae, Hannibal's cavalry commander, a man named Maharbal, came to him with an obvious plan. "Send me ahead with the cavalry. In 5 days, you will dine in victory on the capital in Rome." Hannibal hesitated. Maharbal famously replied, "The gods have not given all gifts to one man. You know how to win a victory, Hannibal, but you do not know how to use one." Hannibal did not march on Rome. To this day, historians argue about why. Some say his army was too exhausted. Some say he didn't have siege equipment to break Rome's massive walls. Some say he was waiting for reinforcements from Carthage that never came. Whatever the reason, Hannibal's hesitation gave Rome time. And Rome was about to do something nobody expected. Inside Rome, panic gripped the city. Women wept in the streets. The Senate was paralyzed. They actually performed human sacrifices, burying people alive to appease the gods. Things were that desperate, but then something remarkable happened. Rome refused to surrender. They didn't even respond to Hannibal's peace offers. They didn't ransom their prisoners. They just kept fighting. They drafted slaves into the army. They armed teenagers. They melted down statues for weapons. The Roman attitude became something close to madness. Surrender was not an option, ever. Even when Hannibal was rampaging through Italy, even when entire Roman armies kept getting destroyed, Rome simply refused to lose. Meanwhile, Hannibal was stuck. He could win every battle he fought, but he couldn't win the war. His army was slowly bleeding away. Every soldier he lost was nearly impossible to replace, while Rome kept finding more men. He marched up and down Italy for 15 years, winning victory after victory, but it didn't matter. Rome wouldn't break. And then a new Roman general emerged, a young man named Publius Cornelius Scipio. Scipio had been at Cannae as a teenager. He'd watched the slaughter. He'd survived. And he had studied Hannibal's tactics obsessively for years. He understood something his elders didn't. You couldn't beat Hannibal in Italy. You had to take the war to him. You had to attack Carthage itself. In 204 BC, Scipio sailed to Africa. The Carthaginian Senate immediately panicked. They sent urgent messages to Hannibal. "Come home." After 15 years in Italy undefeated, Hannibal had to abandon his quest. He returned to defend Carthage, and he was about to face the only man who had ever truly understood him. In 202 BC, Hannibal and Scipio met at a place called Zama, just south of Carthage. For the first time in his life, Hannibal was outnumbered. Scipio had done something brilliant. He had recruited the Numidian cavalry, the same African horsemen who had helped Hannibal win at Cannae. Now they were fighting for Rome. Hannibal still had elephants, 80 of them. He sent them charging at the Roman lines first, but Scipio had prepared for this. He had trained his soldiers to open lanes in their formation. The elephants charged through the gaps without trampling anyone. Some panicked and turned back, trampling Hannibal's own troops. The battle became a brutal infantry fight. And then the Numidian cavalry, the cavalry Hannibal had once relied on, came smashing into his rear. It was Cannae in reverse. For the first time in his career, Hannibal lost. 20,000 of his men died. He escaped with a handful of survivors. The student had defeated the master. Carthage surrendered immediately. The peace terms were brutal. Carthage had to give up its entire navy. They were forbidden from making war without Rome's permission. They had to pay an indemnity so massive it would take 50 years to pay off, and they had to hand over Hannibal himself. Except Hannibal escaped. He fled east, working for various kings as a military advisor, always one step ahead of Roman assassins. He spent the rest of his life on the run. Finally, around 183 BC, cornered in a small village with no escape, the man who had nearly destroyed Rome drank poison. His last words, according to legend, were, "Let us relieve the Romans from the anxiety they have so long experienced." Carthage was broken but not destroyed. For the next 50 years they did the impossible. They rebuilt. They paid their war debt early. Their trade revived. Their farms produced massive crops. By 150 BC, Carthage was rich again. Not militarily powerful, but wealthy, prosperous, happy even, and this terrified Rome. There was a Roman senator named Cato the Elder who had visited Carthage. He came back with figs from Carthaginian gardens and showed them to the Senate. "These figs," he said, "were picked 3 days ago in Carthage. 3 days." His point was simple. Carthage was too close, too rich, too dangerous. From that day forward, Cato ended every single speech he gave in the Senate, no matter the topic, with the same 5 words. Carthage must be destroyed. For years, Cato repeated those words. A speech about taxes: Carthage must be destroyed. A debate about roads: Carthage must be destroyed. A discussion of wine prices: Carthage must be destroyed. It became a meme, basically, but it worked. Slowly, the Roman Senate started to agree. Carthage was too rich, too successful, too alive. So Rome decided to provoke a war. They demanded ridiculous things. First, Carthage had to hand over 300 noble children as hostages. Carthage, terrified, agreed. Then Rome demanded all their weapons, every sword, every spear, every catapult. Carthage handed over 200,000 sets of armor and 2,000 catapults. Then came the final demand, the one Rome knew Carthage could never accept: abandon your city, move 10 miles inland, become a land-based people. Carthage had been a sea power for 700 years. Their entire identity was the sea. They refused. That refusal was exactly what Rome wanted. In 149 BC, the Third Punic War began, but it wasn't really a war. It was an execution. Carthage had no army, no navy, no weapons. They had just handed everything over. But the Carthaginians did something incredible. They turned their entire city into a weapons factory. Women cut off their hair to make bowstrings. Bronze statues were melted down into swords. Old men and children worked day and night forging weapons from scratch. In just a few months, they armed themselves again. When the Roman army arrived, expecting an easy conquest, they found a city ready to fight to the death. The walls of Carthage were massive, over 30 feet thick, 3 layers deep, with chambers inside the walls that could house 300 elephants and 4,000 horses. The Romans tried to attack. They failed. For 3 years, they laid siege to Carthage. 3 years. Finally, in 146 BC, a Roman general named Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of the Scipio who had beaten Hannibal, broke through the walls. What followed was not a battle. It was a slaughter that lasted 6 days and 6 nights. The Romans fought street by street, house by house. Carthaginians threw themselves from rooftops rather than be captured. Mothers killed their own children rather than let them become slaves. The last 900 defenders, including Roman deserters who knew they would be tortured, retreated to the temple at the city's heart. They set it on fire and burned alive inside it rather than surrender. When it was over, 50,000 survivors were sold into slavery. 750,000 Carthaginians were dead, but Rome wasn't finished. They wanted to make sure Carthage never rose again, so they did something unprecedented in the ancient world. They committed cultural genocide. For 17 days, Carthage burned. Every building was torn down, every temple was leveled, every library was put to the torch. Centuries of Carthaginian literature, history, science, and philosophy, gone, forever. We don't even know the names of most Carthaginian gods. We don't know what their cities looked like inside. We don't know their literature, their poetry, their music. All of it was deliberately erased. The legend says the Romans even salted the earth so nothing would ever grow there again. Modern historians debate whether that actually happened, but the message was clear. Carthage was not just defeated. Carthage was deleted. Standing in the smoking ruins, Scipio Aemilianus, the conquering general, did something strange. He wept. His friend, the Greek historian Polybius, asked him why he was crying when he should be celebrating. Scipio quoted a line from Homer about the fall of Troy. "A day will come when sacred Troy shall perish, and Priam and his people shall be slain." Polybius asked what he meant. Scipio said he was thinking about Rome. He had realized that no empire lasts forever. One day Rome too would fall, and he was right. 600 years later, Rome itself would burn, conquered by barbarians, its glory fading into legend. Today you can visit the ruins of Carthage. There's not much to see. Some foundations, a few columns. The harbor where Hannibal's ships once docked is now a quiet bay. Tourists walk past, mostly not knowing they're standing in the grave of a civilization that almost ruled the world. A civilization that gave us Hannibal, the greatest tactical genius in history. A civilization that brought Rome to its knees not once but twice. A civilization so feared that Rome had to erase it entirely just to feel safe. Everything we know about Carthage today, we know from their enemies. The Romans wrote the history books. The Carthaginians never got to tell their side. So the next time someone tells you that history is written by the winners, remember Carthage. Remember Hannibal and his elephants. Remember Canna. Remember a city that burned for 17 days and somehow refused to be forgotten. Drop a comment telling us which part shocked you the most. Honestly, the fig speech from Cato still blows my mind. If you like this deep dive into ancient history, click here to watch how Sparta really fell.